Why did the briefing room go quiet the moment she sat down? Not because she was late, not because she outranked anyone, but because no one expected her to be there. Captain Mara Cade took the empty chair at the far end of the steel table, helmet tucked under one arm, eyes forward. Around her, men shifted. Some glanced at the floor. Others pretended to read folders they already memorized. The room smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. Every deployment did. She felt the familiar sensation settle into her chest. The quiet kind. The one that wasn't fear exactly. It was something colder. Ignored didn't hurt anymore. It just registered. The map lit up on the wall. A convoy route. A desert cut by old roads no one bothered to rename. Somewhere in the American Southwest. Training exercise officially. But Mara had learned long ago that the word exercise often hid unfinished business. Ghosts that never signed out. She listened while commanders talked around her. Objectives, threat models, extraction windows. Her name wasn't mentioned. Not yet. She had flown this terrain before, long before the uniform, long before the scars hidden beneath flight sleeves, back when she was someone else entirely. Someone who fixed things. The memory crept in without permission, the smell of oil, the click of tools, a night that should have been forgotten but never truly was. She pushed it down. This wasn't the place for memory. This was a room built for action, not reflection. Finally, someone cleared their throat. Captain Cade will accompany the team as Overwatch. A pause, then a nod, no questions. That was her role, always had been, the quiet position, the one you didn't notice until it saved you. As the room emptied, Mara remained seated for a second longer. Her pulse was steady, but inside something stirred. This mission wasn't random. She could feel it, like a thread tugging at an old knot. She stood, squared her shoulders, and walked out, unaware that the desert she was heading toward had been waiting for her for 25 years. And that 4 lives, long intertwined with hers, were about to collide again. What kind of soldier remembers the sound of a wrench better than the sound of gunfire? Mara did. On the flight south, as the helicopter cut through late afternoon heat, she stared out over rust-colored land and felt her past press closer. Dust Haven, that was the nearest town now. Back then it had another name. Back then it still breathed. She had been 19, a mechanic by necessity, not ambition. Her father's hands had taught her how to listen, to engines, to stress fractures, to the way metal told the truth when people wouldn't. When he died, the garage became her whole world. She stayed because leaving felt like betrayal. The night of July 16, 1983, she'd been alone. The kind of alone that settles in bones. And then the sound. Metal dragging, a van bleeding oil, 4 men who looked like they'd outrun death and lost by inches. She hadn't asked who they were. She hadn't asked why. She saw injuries, fear, discipline barely holding together. She saw people who didn't have time for questions. So she acted. That choice, small, silent, had followed her into every uniform she ever wore. The helicopter banked. The pilot's voice crackled. 2 minutes. Mara closed her eyes briefly. She wasn't anxious. Not exactly. But there was a tightness beneath her ribs, a sense of returning somewhere unfinished. On the ground, she moved like instinct, Overwatch position, scope aligned, breathing controlled. She scanned terrain the way she once scanned engines, looking for what didn't belong. The convoy rolled through the kill zone without incident. Too clean. Mara stayed alert long after command relaxed. She knew better. Silence wasn't safety. Silence was anticipation. That night in the temporary command tent, she couldn't sleep. The hum of generators faded into the hum of memory. She thought of the men in the van, of the dog tags she'd found afterward, of the number stamped into steel. She'd never learned their names. She'd assumed they were dead. That was easier. She turned onto her side, jaw tight. Soldiers learned to compartmentalize. Mechanics learned to finish the job. She had always been both. She didn't know yet that the desert had recognized her. And that somewhere nearby, 4 men were watching the same stars, carrying the same memory, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Why does survival sometimes feel heavier than loss? The ambush came at dawn. Not loud, not dramatic, just sudden. Precision fire from terrain no drone had flagged, the kind of threat born from experience, not chaos. Myra moved before orders reached her. She always did. Her position gave her the angle no one else had. She identified shooters, calculated wind, made choices that couldn't be undone. Each pull of the trigger was clean, necessary, silent. When it was over, the desert returned to stillness. Later, as medics worked and reports were filed, a man approached her. Civilian clothes, older, silver hair, military posture that never leaves the body. "Captain Cade," he said quietly, "may I speak with you?" Something in his voice made her chest tighten, recognition without memory. They walked a few steps away. He removed his sunglasses. She saw the scar first, then the eyes. Time collapsed. She didn't step back, she didn't speak, she just stared. "I wasn't sure," he said, "but when I saw how you moved, I knew." Her throat felt dry. "You shouldn't be here." He almost smiled. "You said that once." The world narrowed to the two of them, the desert, the past. "4 of us," he continued. "We survived, all because of one night, one woman who didn't ask questions." Mara exhaled slowly. The weight she'd carried for decades shifted, just slightly. "I never forgot," he said. "We looked for years." She nodded. That was all she could manage. "I'm Colonel Reeve," he said, "retired." Names finally attached to ghosts. He hesitated. "We didn't come to interfere. We came because this operation, it traces back to something we never finished, and because we owed you more than silence." Myra looked back toward the convoy, toward the soldiers who would never know how close things had come. "I don't need anything," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why we're here." That night they talked, not about heroics, about life, families, the cost of carrying unfinished gratitude. She learned the others were nearby, watching, waiting. She didn't invite them yet. Some debts needed the right moment. What happens when gratitude waits 25 years to speak? It arrives carefully. After the mission concluded, after commendations she didn't attend and reports she didn't read, Mara returned stateside, back to a town that barely remembered her name. The old garage still stood, barely. She unlocked the door and breathed in dust and oil and memory. The fluorescent light flickered, stubborn as ever. The eviction notice waited on the desk. She sat down, exhaustion finally catching up. For the first time in years, she opened the drawer she never touched. The dog tag rested where she left it. A knock sounded. Not scraping metal this time, firm, respectful. She opened the door. 4 men stood outside. Older, scarred, alive. They didn't rush her, didn't crowd the moment. They just stood there, letting memory catch up. "You saved our lives," one said softly. "We never forgot," another added. They showed her what gratitude looked like when it matured. Deeds, blueprints, a future built not on repayment but on continuation. A place to teach, to fix, to pass on quiet competence. Mara felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, relief. She didn't cry. She never had been the type. She simply nodded. Why do some acts echo longer than gunfire? Because they weren't done for applause. The Tate Memorial Repair and Training Center opened the following year. Young people learned trades. Veterans learned peace. The town breathed again. Mara didn't stay long, she never did, but she visited, quietly, watching students learn to listen to machines the way she once had. The dog tag hung in a small frame, not as a trophy, as a reminder. She returned to service, to missions that would never be public. But something had changed. She no longer carried that night alone. And somewhere between desert stars and humming engines, the truth settled into her bones. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What kind of memory resurfaces only when the rotors slow down? The helicopter's pitch dropped, a subtle change most people never noticed. Mara felt it immediately. Her body registered the deceleration before her mind caught up, the way it always did. Muscles tightened, jaw set. She stared through the open door as the desert rose to meet them, pale and endless, a geography that refused to explain itself. Someone across from her adjusted their harness. Another checked a weapon for the third time. Normal rituals, superstitions dressed up as discipline. Mara didn't move. This land knew her. That thought landed without logic, without evidence, just a pressure behind the eyes. She had crossed worse terrain in darker places, but this felt personal. The roads below twisted like scars that had never healed cleanly. Old routes, forgotten exits, places where people once stopped then didn't. The pilot's voice cut in, 2 minutes. Mara closed her eyes just for a breath, and the past slid in before she could stop it. She remembered the garage door shuddering as it rose, the smell of coolant and dust, the way the night had gone silent when the van rolled in, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. She remembered thinking, just for a second, that she could pretend not to see them, that she could let the door fall back down and go on with her life. She hadn't. That choice had followed her into everything since. The skids touched down, sand billowed, orders snapped into the air. Mara moved with the unit, slipping into her role like a well-worn jacket. Overwatch, distance, the place where you see everything and are seen by no one. As they advanced toward the temporary command site, she scanned the horizon, cataloging shapes and shadows. Her mind did what it always did under pressure. It worked. Calm, methodical, useful. But underneath that, something else stirred. Ignored was an old feeling. She, grown up with it. In the garage, customers used to look past her, waiting for her father to appear. In training, instructors assumed she was lost or late or someone's assistant. She learned early that attention was unreliable, competence was not. Still, there were moments like now, when being unseen carried its own weight. At the briefing tent, she took the empty chair again. Same position, same distance from the center of gravity. The map glowed to life, throwing pale blue across tired faces. Routes were traced, timelines laid out, threats named and categorized. Mara listened. The mission was simple on paper. Escort, observe, extract. No one mentioned why intelligence had flagged this stretch of land again after decades of quiet. No one said why old infrastructure was suddenly relevant. No one asked why a retired colonel had taken such a keen interest in a training exercise. She noticed what others missed, the way certain roads were circled twice, the way a supply cache was marked but not explained, the way the desert was being treated like an adversary rather than a backdrop. She raised a hand. The room paused. A few heads turned, surprised. "There's something wrong with the southern route," she said, not loudly, just clearly. "It looks clean because it's been cleaned, recently." A beat of silence, then someone nodded. Another commander frowned, considering. "Noted," the lead officer said. "We'll adjust if needed." It was a half dismissal, half acceptance. Mara let it go. She'd learned when to push and when to wait. Later, as dusk bled into night, she took position on a low rise overlooking the convoy's rest area. The air cooled quickly, desert heat draining away like a held breath released. Stars emerged, sharp and indifferent. She lay prone, scope steady, and waited. Waiting was something she understood. She'd waited years after that night in 1983, telling herself the men in the van were gone, that whatever they'd been running from had caught them eventually. It was easier than imagining unfinished threads stretching into the future. Her life had narrowed after her father died. The garage became a bunker. Work became a shield. When the eviction notice finally came years later, it hadn't felt like loss so much as inevitability, as if the world was simply closing a door she'd forgotten to open. The military had offered her something different: structure, distance, a way to turn skill into service without asking for explanation. She signed up later than most, older, carrying more history than she admitted, but she'd adapted. She always did. Through the scope she saw movement, not hostile, just life. A coyote slipping between rocks, wind stirring scrub. Still, her pulse stayed elevated. There was a feeling she couldn't name. Not fear, not anticipation, something closer to recognition, like walking into a room you've dreamed about but never actually seen. Footsteps crunched behind her, controlled, familiar. "Mind if I sit?" a voice asked. She didn't turn. "You already did." A soft exhale, almost a laugh, still sharp. Colonel Reeve lay down beside her, keeping his profile low. Even retired, he moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime avoiding unnecessary exposure. "You shouldn't be here," she repeated. "Neither should you," he replied gently. They watched the horizon together for a moment. The silence wasn't awkward, it was earned. "I didn't know it was you," he said finally, "back then." "Good," she answered. "You weren't supposed to." He nodded. "We were running on fumes. The van shouldn't have made it another mile." "But it did. Because of you." She adjusted her scope, focusing on nothing in particular. Praise made her uncomfortable. It always had. It felt like attention, and attention felt dangerous. "You don't know what happened after you left," he continued. "How close it was." She didn't ask him to explain. Some details were better left untouched. "We searched," he said. "Every leave, every scrap of downtime. Town names changed. Records vanished. It was like the desert swallowed you." "It almost did," she said quietly. He studied her, really looked at her for the first time. Not the rank, not the posture, the person beneath. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "That night?" Mara didn't answer right away. She thought of the long hours alone in the garage, of the weight she'd carried without knowing why, of the life she'd built and dismantled and rebuilt again. "No," she said, "but I didn't understand it either." Reeve smiled, small and tired. "None of us did, not until later." A radio crackled softly. "Status check, all clear." Reeve shifted. "The others are here," he said. "They wanted to see you, didn't want to push." Her chest tightened. Names she didn't yet know. Faces she'd memorized in a single night, frozen in blood and exhaustion. "Not tonight," she said. "Of course." He paused. "We didn't come for thanks." She almost smiled. "Good, I don't give it easily." They shared a look, an understanding forged in survival, not sentiment. As he moved away, Mara returned her focus to the desert, but the night felt different now, less empty, charged. She realized something then, lying there under a sky unchanged by decades. The past wasn't finished with her, not because of guilt, not because of debt, but because sometimes, when you act without asking for anything in return, the world remembers. And it waits, quietly, patiently, until the moment you're ready to see what your silence built. Why did the desert feel louder after the shooting stopped? Not because of echoes, not because of chaos, but because silence, once broken, never truly returns the same. The ambush ended the way most real ones did, without drama, without victory poses, just a sudden drop in noise, a body falling where it shouldn't, a radio squelch that came half a second too late, then nothing. Mara stayed in position long after command declared the area secure. Her finger rested along the frame of her rifle, not on the trigger. She breathed slow, counted heartbeats. Let the adrenaline burn itself out the way she'd learned to let engines cool before touching them. Below her, medics moved with quiet urgency, not frantic, focused. One soldier sat on the ground, helmet off, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Another leaned against a vehicle, eyes closed, lips moving in a private conversation with something unseen. Mara had seen this look before, too many times. The moment right after survival, when the body realizes it's still alive but the mind hasn't caught up yet. She scanned anyway, left, right, far ridge, near rocks, the place where the southern route curved just enough to hide trouble. Her earlier warning echoed faintly in her thoughts, clean because it's been cleaned. She was right. She hated that she was right. When she finally stood and slung her rifle, the weight in her legs surprised her. Not weakness, fatigue. The kind that didn't come from hours of movement but from years of carrying readiness like a second spine. As she walked back toward the command vehicles, she felt it again. That sensation of being watched not by an enemy but by memory, by time itself. Reeve stood off to one side, speaking quietly with another man. Broader shoulders, thick neck, the posture of someone who'd once relied on physical dominance and learned the hard way that discipline outlasts strength. Mara recognized him instantly. The linebacker build, the arm he'd held tight against his body, the eyes that never stopped checking angles. Idris. He turned before Reeve finished speaking. Their eyes met. 25 years collapsed into a single breath. For a second neither of them moved. Then Idris nodded once. Slow, respectful, no rush, no surprise. "Captain," he said, his voice was deeper now, rougher. "You look steady." She almost laughed, almost. "You shouldn't be here," she repeated, because it was easier than saying everything else. Idris glanced toward the medics, then back at her. "Neither should most of us. We make do." They stood there, two people connected by a night neither of them had spoken about aloud until now. "You still fix things?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "Different kind of systems." He smiled faintly. "Figures." A third man approached, walking with a subtle hitch, perfectly balanced, perfectly controlled, the limp you only noticed if you knew what to look for. "Pen." He stopped a few steps away, like he was unsure whether he had permission to be there. His hair had gone thin. His eyes hadn't changed at all. "I used to imagine what you looked like," he said. "I was always wrong." Mara studied him, the youngest back then, the one who tried to help and nearly collapsed doing it. "You survived," she said. He nodded. "Because you wouldn't let me bleed on your tools." Something in her chest loosened, just a fraction. The fourth man stayed back, scarred neck, controlled posture, pain held at bay by habit rather than medication. "Silas." He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone who'd learned to sit with other people's pain without trying to fix it. "You never asked our names," he said. "That's what stayed with me." Myra looked at all four of them now, alive, altered, still carrying the shape of that night. "I didn't need them," she said. Reeve watched her carefully. "That's what we needed to understand, why you did it." She considered the question. The honest answer wasn't noble, it wasn't heroic. "I was tired," she said finally, "tired of deciding who deserved help." No one argued with that. They didn't linger, that wasn't their way. The mission wrapped up efficiently. Debriefings happened without sentiment. Paperwork swallowed the incident whole. But that night, after the equipment was secured and the generators hummed low, Mara sat alone on the edge of the camp and felt something unfamiliar creep in. Not pride. Grief. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd never allowed herself to acknowledge. She'd spent years believing that night in 1983 was a closed chapter, a thing done and buried. But seeing them, older, marked by lives fully lived, forced a realization she hadn't prepared for. Her choice hadn't ended when the van disappeared into the dark. It had multiplied. She thought of the garage she'd lost. The eviction notice folded and unfolded until the paper softened. The training center plans she'd never drawn because she'd never imagined a future large enough to hold them. Her life had been about containment, about doing the job then stepping back. She never stayed long enough to see outcomes, only exits. A soft crunch of footsteps approached. Reeve sat beside her without asking this time. "You okay?" he asked. She watched the horizon, where the land stretched flat and unforgiving. "I don't know what to do with this." "With what?" "With the fact that something I did once mattered longer than I expected." He nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part for people like us." "People like us," she repeated. "People who act," he said. "Not for recognition, just because something broken and we're the closest ones who can fix it." She huffed a quiet breath. Fixing is easier than staying. Reeve didn't disagree. They sat there as the night deepened. No speeches, no vows, just the shared understanding that some connections didn't need maintenance to endure. Later, alone in her quarters, Mara lay awake staring at the ceiling. The hum of electricity reminded her of the old fluorescent light in the garage, the way it flickered but never fully died. She realized something then, something unsettling, something hopeful. The desert hadn't been calling her back to relive the past. It had been calling her forward, toward a reckoning she hadn't known she was ready for, toward a moment when silence would finally have to decide what it meant, and whether she would keep hiding inside it or let it become something else entirely. What do you do when the past doesn't accuse you, but waits? Mara didn't sleep. She lay on the narrow cot inside the temporary quarters, boots lined with military precision beneath it, hands folded on her stomach like she was bracing for impact. The ceiling above her vibrated softly with the generator's rhythm. Steady, reliable, nothing like her thoughts. She wasn't anxious, that was the strange part. Anxiety had a shape, a sound, a purpose. This was different. This was weight. For years she had survived by moving forward without looking sideways. Missions, transfers, quiet commendations she never displayed. People learned quickly not to ask her about her past. She gave them nothing to hold on to. But tonight the past had faces, voices, scars that had aged. She turned her head slightly and stared at the shadow cast by the doorframe. It reminded her of the garage office back in Dust Haven. The way moonlight used to cut across the desk, catching on the edge of the drawer she never opened. The drawer with the dog tag. She closed her eyes. In the early morning, before the camp fully woke, she dressed and stepped outside. The desert was cold now, stripped of yesterday's heat. Pale light crept across the horizon, revealing everything slowly, honestly. She found them near the vehicles. All four. No formation, no hierarchy, just men standing with coffee cups, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold like civilians again. When they noticed her, conversation stopped. Not out of respect. Out of care. "You leaving?" Penn asked too quickly. "Not yet," she said. That seemed to ease something. They stood there for a moment, unsure how to bridge the gap between memory and now. It was Silas who broke the silence. "We never talked about what came after," he said. "Not really." Mara looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he replied, "but I want to." She waited. Silas took a breath. "After we left your garage, we didn't stop for almost 2 days. The van held together longer than it had any right to. Long enough to get us out. Long enough for extraction." Idris shook his head, a faint smile touching his mouth. "We still argue about which part should have failed first." Mara almost smiled herself. "And after?" she asked. Reeve answered this time. "After we went back to work, different theaters, different lives, but that night became a reference point. not just for survival but for trust. Penn nodded. When things got bad, we'd say it. Garage night bad. And somehow that reminded us we'd already lived through worse. Mara felt something shift in her chest, a subtle realignment, like an engine finally running true after years of vibration. "You built whole lives," she said quietly. "Yes," Silas replied, "because you gave us time." Time. She had never thought of it that way. They didn't ask about her life. That, too, felt intentional. They sensed where questions would bruise rather than heal. Still, Idris glanced toward her hands. "You ever regret staying so long?" She flexed her fingers, grease long replaced by calluses earned elsewhere. "I regret confusing endurance with purpose." Reeve watched her closely. "You don't do that anymore." "No," she agreed. "I just haven't replaced it with anything yet." That was the truth she rarely said out loud. Later that day, after official goodbyes and quiet handshakes, Mara returned to Dust Haven alone. She hadn't planned to. Her orders didn't require it. But something pulled her there, something unfinished. The town looked smaller than memory, quieter, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, just emptied out. The garage stood at the edge like it always had. Same slumped posture, same faded sign, TATE and Son, still a lie, still standing. She unlocked the door. The smell hit her first. Oil dust time. She walked through slowly, boots echoing against concrete. The old workbench still bore her father's careful marks, wrench outlines etched into wood, order carved into chaos. She stopped at the office desk. Opened the drawer. The dog tag lay where it always had. She picked it up. Cold. Real. For the first time in decades, she turned it over in her hands without hurry, without dismissal. "You weren't supposed to follow me this far," she murmured, to the memory, to herself, to the weight of consequence. A sound outside made her straighten. Engines. Multiple. She stepped to the window. 4 black SUVs rolled into the lot and stopped in a clean line. Her breath caught, not in fear but in recognition. They hadn't rushed her, hadn't ambushed the moment. They had waited until she chose to return here on her own. She opened the bay door. They stood there in the morning light, older now than when she'd last seen them, but steadier too, less haunted. "We didn't want to assume," Reeves said, "but we hoped." "Hoped what?" she asked. "That you'd let us finish the story," Silas said. Idris handed her a folder. She didn't open it right away. "What if I say no?" she asked. Reeve met her gaze evenly. "Then we walk away, grateful all the same." She believed him. She opened the folder. Deeds, plans, numbers that made her dizzy, not charity, investment, continuation. Her throat tightened. "You didn't owe me this," she said. "No," Penn replied softly. "We owed the world what you showed us." She looked at the blueprints, bays filled with light, training spaces, a future that didn't require her to disappear in order to function. "You could have forgotten," she said. Idris shook his head. "Some debts don't expire, they just wait for you to be ready to see them." Myra closed the folder. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then she nodded. Not because she needed saving, but because, for the first time, she allowed herself to stay. And as the desert wind moved through the open garage, stirring dust and memory alike, she understood something at last. Strength wasn't just surviving alone. Sometimes it was letting what you fixed come back and fix something in you. What happens after redemption, when the noise fades and the work begins? The first hammer strike echoed louder than it should have. Mara stood at the edge of the lot, arms folded, watching as the old garage finally gave way to something new. The corrugated metal walls came down in sections, each collapse sending up a cloud of dust that hung in the air before drifting off toward the highway. She didn't flinch. She thought she would, but she didn't. Grief had already done its worst years ago. What she felt now wasn't loss, it was release. Beside her, Reeve stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back. Idris spoke with a contractor, voice low, precise. Silas watched the workers with the eyes of someone trained to notice strain and fatigue. Penn sat on the tailgate of a truck, prosthetic leg extended, explaining something animatedly to a young engineer who listened like he was being handed a map to the future. They hadn't taken over. That mattered to her. They had offered resources, not control. Support, not spotlight. The center would bear her father's name because it felt right, not because it made a statement. The town watched from a distance at first. Dust Haven had learned to be suspicious of hope. It had been promised too many revivals that ended in boarded windows and apology letters. People passed slowly, lingered longer than necessary, pretended not to stare. Mara understood them. She had been one of them. When construction began in earnest, she rolled up her sleeves and joined in, not because anyone expected it, but because that's how she knew how to exist. She fixed what broke, adjusted what didn't fit, spoke when silence no longer served a purpose. At night she drove home tired in a way that felt honest, earned. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Silas found her alone in the half-framed classroom space. "You don't have to prove anything," he said gently. She tightened a bolt and stood. "I'm not." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good." The students came before the building was finished. Word traveled faster than concrete cured. Young people from nearby towns, veterans unsure how to translate discipline into civilian life, people who didn't want pity, just direction. Mara watched them with a mix of pride and discomfort. Pride because they worked hard, discomfort because she wasn't used to being seen as something stable. She taught without speeches, showed instead of told, how to listen to an engine, how to recognize stress before it became failure, how to fix what you could and walk away from what you couldn't. One afternoon, a teenager asked her why the center existed. She wiped her hands on a rag and answered honestly, "Because someone once helped me when they didn't have to." That was all. The four men came and went. Reeve brought his daughter once, a quiet girl with curious eyes who lingered near the tools. Idris funded expansions without ceremony. Silas ran workshops that ended with more listening than talking. Penn brought his students, watching them absorb the space like proof that history could still be taught forward. Mara never made a display of the dog tag, but she placed it in a small shadow box on the wall near the entrance. No plaque, just the number. People noticed it, some asked, she never explained. At night, alone in her small house, she sometimes felt the old pull to pack up, to leave before roots set too deep. That instinct didn't vanish easily. Survival habits rarely did. But she stayed. Not because she was afraid to leave. Because she finally had a reason not to. One evening, long after the center officially opened, Mara locked up and stepped outside to find the town quiet in a different way. Not empty, resting. She looked down the highway where traffic now slowed just a little as it passed the exit. Enough to notice. Enough to stop. She thought of the young woman she'd been in 1983. Tired, alone, capable without knowing it. She wished she could tell her something. Not that it would all work out. Just that the things you fix when no one's watching can become foundations. That dignity doesn't need witnesses to be real. Myra turned off the lights and walked to her truck. The desert sky stretched wide above her, stars sharp and steady. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of something about to end. She felt like she was standing inside something that would last. And that, she realized, was its own kind of victory. Not loud, not celebrated, but real. Why do some endings feel quieter than beginnings, yet heavier? The dedication ceremony wasn't large. No flags, no speeches worth quoting, no cameras circling for the right angle, just folding chairs, uneven rows, and a handful of people who had learned not to expect miracles, but still showed up when one tried to happen anyway. Mara stood near the back, hands clasped, listening to someone else speak her father's name. It sounded different when it came from another mouth. Less sharp, softer, like it finally belonged to the world again instead of just her memory. She didn't look at the plaque. She didn't need to. What mattered was the sound inside the building behind her, tools clinking, low conversation, laughter that didn't feel out of place. The center had been open for months now, and already the walls had learned new rhythms. Work rhythms, learning rhythms, the kind that didn't demand perfection, only presence. Reeve stood beside her, not as a colonel, not even as a leader, just as a man who had learned the long cost of unfinished gratitude. "You disappear when things get official," he said quietly. She didn't deny it. "I function better on the edges." He nodded. "You always did." They watched as a group of students filtered inside, some still in work boots, some holding notebooks like lifelines. One of them waved at Mara, quick, unassuming, grateful without being loud. She lifted a hand in return. That simple exchange hit harder than any medal ever could. Later, after the chairs were stacked and the last visitor left, Mara walked through the building alone. She did this often, not out of worry, but respect. The way you check on something you care about without needing it to prove itself. She paused in the main bay. New tools hung where her father's old outlines had once been. Different brands, better lighting, the same purpose. She rested a hand on the workbench and closed her eyes. For a moment she was 19 again, the fluorescent light flickering, the radio stuck between stations, the sound of metal scraping outside the door. She let the memory play through this time without flinching. The van, the men, the choice. Back then she hadn't known it was courage. She hadn't known it was mercy. She hadn't known it was anything worth remembering. It was just action. Now, standing in a place built from that single night, she finally understood something that had taken her a lifetime to learn. Meaning doesn't arrive when you do something extraordinary. It arrives when you do something necessary and refuse to abandon it just because no one is watching. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Penn, a photo attached. A classroom, teenagers bent over engines, one of them wearing a shirt that read, "Fix what you can, learn the rest." She exhaled, a sound halfway between laughter and release. Outside, the desert wind moved gently across the lot, not harsh tonight, almost patient, as if the land itself had accepted what now stood on it. Mara locked the doors and stepped into the open air. She thought of the years she'd spent believing she was only useful in crisis, that her value lived in emergencies and ended when the danger passed. The military had reinforced that belief. So had solitude. But this place, this quiet, steady work, had taught her something different. Strength wasn't about being needed only when things broke. It was about staying long enough to help others build. She climbed into her truck but didn't start the engine right away. Instead, she looked once more at the building, lights dimmed but not dark, waiting for morning. Somewhere far back in her mind, the drawer closed. The dog tag found its rest. She no longer carried the night of 1983 as a question. It had become an answer that didn't shout, didn't demand recognition, didn't even ask to be remembered. It simply existed, solid, quiet, and true. Mara turned the key. The engine started cleanly. She pulled onto the road and drove home under a sky full of stars that didn't care who noticed them. And in that vast, indifferent quiet, one truth remained, clear as steel, steady as hands that know their work. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.